Okay, well, let me get this started before the afternoon winds on too far. Let me welcome everyone for being here. We wanted this to be an intimate conversation with Barney, and I see it's going to be. We're not overwhelmed with people. The reason why, when Tony Hurd told me that Barney was going to be in town, I was delighted. We've known each other for a very long time. First met when I was an embassy officer in South Africa in 1975 to 1980. In those days, things were quite simple for the American embassy. We had an officer who covered black politics and an officer who covered white politics. I was the one who covered black politics. And so when I got in the country and it was incumbent on me to go and meet some significant black leaders. Of course, I went and sought out Steve Biko and Barney Pityana and Mampilo Rampelli and a number of others like that. So I became, on the periphery from an outsider's point of view, very involved in the Eastern Cape community. And actually, I'm pleased now at this stage of my life to count the Biko family and Bandi Mbiko, Bandi Mvovo. I always say Mvovo before I get to the Biko, as one of my closest friends. And the last time I saw Barney, as a matter of fact, was at the wedding of one of Steve and Mampila's sons here at the American University. And it's actually only then that I realized, and I'm being quite serious about this, that I realized what a patronage role you are seen as by many of the not just the stalwarts of black consciousness, which was kind of the motivating ideology of the day in the 1970s because of the bannings of the ANC and the PAC and et cetera, but because he's emerged as such a wise spokesman and wonderful analyst and independent and free spokesman for a spokesperson for South Africa and the disadvantaged majority there. And it was very obvious at this wedding the role that he played as sort of everyone's grandfather. and I was just so pleased. So when I learned that you were going to be here, I wanted to have you here at the center. We do a lot of programs that focus on South Africa, but this thing today has no agenda. I want this to be a conversation. I very purposely sent out invitations to individuals who I know were involved in South Africa from that era, including some American diplomats who are here, and also South Africans who I know have been very involved in the whole struggle in the conflict that's gone on there. So before we turn it over to you, Barney, and you could say whatever you want to say, but I think I'd love to have this just be a conversation. So because I know that a lot of people would love to hear not only reminiscence of that era, but where you've come to since. You've been most recently the Vice Chancellor and Principal of UNISA, a major institution of education in South Africa, but also we know its roots and how it was very interesting that the black communities programs and other black consciousness groups were using UNISA for distance learning during those days for people who'd been in prison and all. I remember talking to Steve about that, and so it's a very, very interesting institution. But education in general is a key element of Africa, South Africa's future, and whereas it may be in some ways much more advanced than other parts of the continent, with major universities like UNISA and Cape Town and Wits and others, there's a long way to go to reach the general population. So there's a number of issues I'm sure that are on people's mind, including what does Jacob Zuma mean for U.S. and South African relations? But you can talk about anything you want to talk about. But let me start by having everyone introduce themselves, because I think most of us know each other, but I think you'll find it interesting to know what the connections are. And when you introduced yourselves, talk about your connections to South Africa. So let's begin here.
Okay. I'm Kathy Lawrence. I head up the UNISA Foundation, which is really which is about development of universities of business, and I also head up the alumni of UNISA.
Oh.
So that's a rather tall to us.
It is.
My name is Mirandal. I'm from Cape Town, but I'm at the moment at the U.S. Institute of Peace as a fellow.
I'm Greg Young. I've not been to Africa or South Africa. I'm interested very much. I'm here to say for a few months away, trying to write a monograph on global education of lawyers at the business school and law school.
So the education angle in particular, but yeah.
I'm Ellen Mott. My husband is a Wilson Scholar on the Asia side. I long time ago wrote a master's thesis on Hamlet in the late 50s.
I'm Nidira Bayat. I'm the Counselor for Multilateral Affairs at the South African Embassy here in DC. And I met Bonnie first in 1996 when I was the Dito intern of the African Commission in the Gambia.
Yeah.
And then when I was at the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria, and he was at the Human Rights Commission, and it was good to see you again, Bonnie.
That's good to see you. Lost touch.
I'm Simon Barber. I'm currently U.S. Country Manager for a thing called the International Marketing Council of South Africa, which is a small government agency that helps promote South Africa. And previously, I was the Washington correspondent for many years for the Business Day and other newspapers in its stable Sunday Times. And for a long time, worked for Tony Hurd.
I'm Maggie Westmoreland. I'm a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. I've been involved in South Africa since the 70s, early 70s, in a private capacity at the African American Institute, Institute of International Education, before I came into state. Spent quite a lot of time in South Africa and in and out for some years until I was asked to leave. And only because I'm the mother of the University Preparation Program.
That's right. Okay. Well, Barney?
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for the invitation. I wish to thank Priscilla Clapp as well for, in her way, facilitating this. And my colleagues, Joe Dishaw, as well as Pat Lawrence. We are here as a part of a delegation from UNISA to strengthen partnerships and collaboration with U.S. institutions to look out for possibilities of funding and fundraising for our projects with U.S. foundations. But also we are meeting with UNISA alumni who are here and trying to build an alumni base in the United States, and that's very, very important for us. I was delighted to be invited to come here. At first, I thought I was going to just spend time talking about higher education in South Africa, until I saw the blurb that Steve must have set out, and I had to rethink what would be the right thing to do. Let me just say, the obvious thing to say is that South Africa and South Africans today, really and truly the only show in town is the FIFA 2010 World Cup, I suppose.
Yeah.
And there's beginning to be some real excitement about that. I think that excitement, in some respects, has nothing to do with whether Bafana Bafana are going to win or likely to win.
Is there any chance involved? I'm sorry.
It has something to do with the fact that South Africa, not for the first time, is receiving the world and as an opportunity to showcase who we are and what we're doing and what are the possibilities in South Africa. I always liken this, to something like I support Kaizer Chiefs. I really don't know why I support Kaizer Chiefs, because I don't have any rational reason for supporting Kaizer Chiefs. I can't even remember how I came to feel that I support Kaizer Chiefs. But the guy who's my driver at the university is a passionate fan of Kaizer Chiefs. He goes into mourning when Kaizer Chiefs loses for several days, and he can't be aroused at all. He gets into a state of utter and total depression. And he can't understand it when I say to him, you know what, if Kaizer Chiefs loses, it's okay, I'll then support SuperSport. He says, but you can't do that. You can't. You either achieve as Kaizer Chiefs or you're not. Because I say, no, that's fine, I support Kaizer Chiefs when it wins. If it doesn't win, I support SuperSport. And he can't understand this. I think it's a similar thing with Bafana Bafana. Whether they lose or not, we remain South Africans. That's the big thing. And I get the impression that skeptics are likely to be proved wrong about the capacity of South Africa to stage an event of that nature. I do think that it is a wonderful opportunity. But what it has done also, I think it has stimulated economic activity, as you would see from the road works and the stadia. And one of the things that I hope will be a spin-off to that would be serious development work for sport, not just football, for sport in general. And instead of the local organizing committee being rather anxious to get bonuses into their pockets, I think they ought rather to be putting money to make sure that as a result of the World Cup, there will be real dedicated sports foundations, sports development in the country, and that those stadia will not become white elephant, and that they will really be in the service of the people of South Africa. I say that for another reason, which always surprises me, that we, as a country, we don't seem to focus on this so much. If you have a country where last year, for example, I think about 350,000 young South Africans finished school and qualified to go to higher education. Higher education institutions could only accept 100,000 of them. And the reality is that there's nearly 200,000 young South Africans out there who haven't been able to get a place in any higher education institution. And many of them will be out of employment, and they will be for a very long time. And many of them will not necessarily be involved in any skills training or development at all. It always surprises me that there isn't a huge movement in the country of community colleges, skills training and development, and enabling young people to give them some sense of hope. Everybody seems to be resigned to the fact that there is a high unemployment in the country. It's talked about in a very casual manner. And whereas it is a disaster for a country like that to have so many young people unable to find gainful employment of any kind. Having painted that, it's also important to say that the political scene. Before I do that, let me just say that one of the it's important for me to say that my passion has been in recent years very much from within the University of South Africa in higher education in general. And I've been privileged to have been Vice Chancellor of UNISA for the last 9 years almost. And been able out of that to provide what I like to believe is comment and analysis of South African public life in a manner that I like to think is independent and challenging. Because I think that as a higher education I hardly ever call myself an intellectual, and I'm not too sure that one is entitled to do that. But I think that it is more important that for the sake of all of us in our country, it is very, very important that we be freed as South Africans to make the comment that are appropriate for the time. I always tell people that one of the rights I claim for myself to do that, besides being a South African, is the fact that, like so many people of my generation, as Steve says, we've been very much part of the movement for the end of apartheid and for the democratization of our country, for freedom. I know how my family and I we agonized so much about whether we should actually come back to South Africa at the time we did. We thought long and hard whether I should actually leave the job I was doing in Geneva and come to what may well have seemed like an uncertain future in South Africa. We made the decision to come to South Africa precisely because I argued that we would never have any moral capacity to engage and comment and participate in the debates about South Africa if we actually are not prepared to take the risks that come with going there. So we went back, and I believe at least for me, I claimed for myself the right to be, if needs be, a troubling commentator to whatever happens in the country. And I count that as a privilege, because there are many other people who really haven't been able to do so. The second thing that I say, like I said at the time of the inauguration of the president on the 10th of May, it's also important to say that we do that precisely because we believe in and are committed to the best for our country, to try to make sure that whatever the circumstances, we will continue to be part of the building and development of that country, regardless of who at any one time is in charge. And we do that, and you notice that I'm avoiding to use the word patriotism, because I'm not quite sure, because it doesn't mean my country right or wrong. That's not where I am. It is really about being capable of releasing what energies and intellect one has to contribute to the development of one's country. And I'd like to think that's what we are doing and are committed to do. Now, looking back with that kind of background, often there is a view that is expressed as to whether people like ourselves, so-called intellectuals in the country, are really and truly making the right kind of contributions in the development of the country, or whether not sufficient of us are being silenced or silent. Often we are told that there was a time in the under apartheid, in the worst days of apartheid, where so many people were ready and willing and able to express themselves and to take responsibility for their future, whether it's in the church or in the grassroots justice movement, in national democratic movement. And people are saying that then what is happening? Where is the voice of reason in South Africa at certain times? Or looked at differently, how do we recover a voice that really brings people together into a common environment of contributing to change in the country? I think in part a great deal of this has to do with the kind of politics that South Africa has been part of. The politics of a dominant, very strong national liberation movement that is, rightly or wrongly, has claimed for itself the right to be the spokesperson of the oppressed people of our country, and has been allowed to express itself that way, and all of us are party to that. And the effect of it has been a struggle that tends to marginalize other voices within and without. To say that exactly who really speaks for and communicates for a country whose history is so complex as South Africa, whose peoples are so complex as South Africa is. How could we ever have allowed ourselves into a kind of one-track system? The second one is to recognize, precisely because of that, that in fact, even for the ANC, it is usually dangerous to think that, if you like, there is one ANC, there's one thought, even in the ANC, because not just 2007 Polokwane has shown the diversity of thinking and aspiration within the same organization, but actually for a very long time we've become used to the idea that ANC is the dominant organization in thinking, and we've been inclined not to recognize how diverse, in fact, the organization itself is. And when you read South African newspapers, you get surprised that everybody's surprised that there are contentions of the kind that there are within the ANC, as if to say, why are they doing that? Because they belong together after all. And I find that one of the most refreshing things about South African politics is that there is contention of the kind that we see. And I think that's a hopeful sign for our country. The third area that draws from that for me is that as a result of that, what we've come used to, we talked about justice movements, and there have been efforts at people saying that, if we are really going to have a grassroots movement for justice and democracy in the country of the kind that we had known, there's no need to do that because it can be done within the ANC at the local branch level. But in fact, people are now recognizing that actually that is not a vehicle for that any longer, if it ever was. Because much of the, in my view anyway, the contention around service delivery is not the eruption, if you like, of a real justice movement of the kind we know. It is in fact the contention for resources within the same organization. It is actually a group of people who take over the organization or seek to take over the organization and remove others in order for them to be the right persons at the right place at the right time. For many people on the fringes of many of our communities, what actually goes on there is never really going to benefit them in any shape or form, whether you've got another councillor, and as has been observed by ANC, there is within the organization efforts at unseating other councillors in order to put others, or trying to unseat the mayor. The media, I think, unwisely talk about service delivery protests, but I think it's got very little to do with that. It's got everything to do with contention for resources, for power, and the use of power in particular ways within the same organization. I'm very, very interested. I come from Eastern Cape. Some of the old people in my family, we had a family gathering recently. And some of the old folk were saying, I can't remember what the conversation was. We actually think that Jacob Zuma is very bad, but will never abandon the ANC. He can go whatever, he can do whatever he like. ANC is ours. and you say to yourself, that is actually quite deep-seated. It's not that people think that ANC is a pure organization necessarily. They know that it is badly led. They have all sorts of issues around the president of the ANC. But don't think that's going to translate with them not voting ANC. They are going to vote ANC because they are claiming in their own thinking, they are claiming ANC as their organization. It is not Jacob Zuma's organization. The fourth area that I think is worth looking at, and a whole cluster, I think, is a cluster around the moral dimensions of our democracy. Everywhere we go, there is an issue around corruption. Everywhere we go, there's a contention around resources, tenders or tenderpreneurs is a new term that has come to the lexicon in South Africa these days. And whatever it is, people are really beginning to say, what is it that can be done to really address the scourge of crime? Or who is behind crime? Why is it that we can't, as a country, as society, deal effectively with people who are siphoning away resources of the country from the poor and getting into their own pockets? Part of the difficulty for dealing with that, is certainly, at least in my analysis, is that so much of the leadership of the ANC are people who have been or are involved in large-scale corruption. The president himself, in fact, though he was not charged and to that extent is innocent until proved guilty, notwithstanding that, the truth of the matter is that there is an investigation that has, according to the prosecutors, has got a lot of evidence for which, at the very least, they believe he ought to appear before a court and defend himself. And to that extent, that opportunity was never made possible. And even as the then acting director of the National Prosecution Authority said that the evidence stands, he said himself, the evidence stands. However, we think it has become contaminated in order to enable us to make a credible case before the court. And with it, therefore, is something that says, in a country with so much rampaging poverty, unemployment, why is it that we've not been able to address the issues that affect most of our people deeply, in terms of levels of inequality that continue in the country, the enrichment of the few that is very much continuing its effect in the country, inadequate health facilities that are crumbling in many respects, HIV/AIDS that is killing so many people, schools and schooling systems that are definitely not rewarding or enabling the country to have a new flow of skilled young people. The priorities that are being talked about. And you ask yourself from government, the new government has multiplied government that is big government at its worst or at its best, depending how you look at it. With enormous bureaucratization of resources that really don't go where they matter. In addition to that, a scheme that says that ministers almost are supposed to be monitoring and evaluation processes in the presidency, marginalizing the frontline providers of services in the civil service itself, the people who are made accountable in the new scheme are ministers, not directors general, as one would have thought. So there are important issues in terms of how government works. Big government, where there's a major contention, National Planning Commission, Department of Trade and Industry, Ministry for Economic Planning, Economic Development. Clearly, some of these issues were not thought through very, very carefully, and there is no evidence that they are likely to be resolved, even if they were to be rethought. And all of these are resource issues that are resource intensive, and resources that I think should or could or must be deployed to address the critical issues that affect the people in the country in general. So the ethics of our democracy and public life are very much in the spotlight and need to be looked at. And finally, for me, is an issue of leadership. Whether in fact the caliber of leadership, I'm talking for a moment at all levels of the country, by the way, but I'm thinking for a moment in the political sphere. Whatever what might have been the promise and the intention of a Jacob Zuma presidency for the country, and I want to accept that for many people there was a genuine desire to bring in a very different kind of leadership. And whether that leadership has delivered what it promised, by all accounts, doesn't seem to. And whether there is, as somebody said recently, there's a leadership of silence or avoidance, or a leadership that appears to promise everything to everybody. The long and short of it, the common view, I think, is that South Africa is without leadership, in effect, at the critical levels of what is necessary to guide the country in terms of the way it should go. In part, some of that has to do with whether the African National Congress, as a dominant party, is able to be led to some extent by anybody, because part of the revolt with Thabo Mbeki was that he was asserting hands-on leadership. Now we have a leadership that is not hands-on. There is some sort of revolt at the same time. So the question that must be asked by whoever aspires to become a leader is, what kind of leadership are we talking about? Have we really thought through what we mean by leadership in the circumstances of our country today? The contention with the ANC Youth League, and there are questions as to whether who is behind the president of the ANC Youth League, Mr. Malema. And from what I can see, as somebody who's worked very much with the youth formations in our country, I don't quite honestly see, and who's been very much part of the ANC Youth League, I don't have any sense of the ANC Youth League being engaged in the development of young people in the country. I don't recall any pronouncement by the leader of the ANC Youth League, by anybody in the Youth League, that I can say is about the advancement of young people in the country. It's not about the education of young people. It's not about what we do with the future of young people in a country. And it would seem to me that if the contention was about that, there would be a groundswell of support by people who are saying the agenda for young people in our country needs to be put firmly where policy is being shaped. One doesn't have a sense that is in fact what is happening. So for many young people, therefore, there is widespread disillusionment and despair. And therefore I'm not that in terms of where we go, in terms of the future, I'm not surprised that ANC frankly doesn't know what to do about Julius Malema and them. And to move away from the ANC, I have a sense as an observer that of the other political parties, by far, Helen Zille seems to and has built and grown the Democratic Alliance in an incredible way. I think more and more people are really beginning to respond to what she says and how she says it. And I sense that the Democratic Alliance is growing very strongly under Zille. Of course, there are issues as to whether there's a real commitment to a real meaningful integration and non-racist society of the kind that some of us have a vision on. But there is no doubt that if there is any political leader and political party that is really making headway, the sense I have is that the Democratic Alliance definitely does. It's a pity that the Congress of the People has gotten embroiled in endless problems. Something in me, however, says that if we are all honest, we'll be surprised if it didn't. But we did expect a larger level of maturity and commitment than appears to have been shown so far. I'm not myself convinced that that can be cured by some grand coalition of opposition forces, which will end up being a kind of anti-ANC force. I'm not sure that that's what is desirable from the point of view of many of our people. So the real issue, given all of that, then, how do we see the future? I personally think. Let me also say one last thing about the left forces. I think that there's some of the most rational voices in South Africa today, perhaps, is Zwelinzima Vavi. And I think from a COSATU base, Vavi has become the voice of reason in the country to an amazing extent. And I think also close to that, Dr. Blade Nzimande has become a very strong voice of reason, who put their finger on the pulse of what is happening in the country and stating it as it is. For many of us, many of the issues that the South African Communist Party is raising are worthy of support and speak a lot to what we should be concerned about. Equality, dealing with the issues of poverty, addressing corruption and bad, toxic leadership. And the reality, which is a bit surprising, I don't have an answer to this. It seems to me that, I must confess that my eyes were open to this by a comment by Helen Zille the other day when she was challenged about the fact that they were forming a conservative coalition. And she said, and I think she's right, actually, in South Africa, all the conservative forces are in ANC. The National Party or New National Party, people are in ANC. Martinus van Schalkwyk is a respected minister and leader in the party. Freedom Front is a minister in the ANC government as we speak. We've got today, in a manner that was never conceivable before, with the Zuma presidency, a large number of conservative culture IFP people have moved away from IFP. They've moved in large block to be part of the ANC, completely marginalized and about to kill IFP. There doesn't seem to be any reason for there to be IFP when there is an ANC under Zuma. The reality, of course, is that the ANC has become a very conservative organization, is led in a very conservative, cultural, tribal even manner. And those of us who've been part of ANC for a long time, I cannot imagine ever there having been a more conservative president of ANC than there is at the moment. And that speaks to certain conservative tendencies in the country that are worrying. And for that reason, it seemed to me that there is a place for some sort of left or center coalition that would be very, very important. That really begins, and I'm not seeing it, by the way, that is really beginning to say that there are certain things that the ANC, as it is currently composed, is just completely incapable of ever addressing in the country. A more equal society will never be a feature, a truth in society in the current dispensation at all. And sometimes you wonder what is the role of the left, to the extent that it is parties in the alliance. No wonder there is so much contention and disillusionment. So given that, it would seem, therefore, what as a country we really need, perhaps, is a much is a much stronger moral, ethical voice about moral conduct, quality of moral leadership and transformatory leadership than there is at the moment, where there is just crass materialism and greed that has become so much part and parcel of value. In fact, that's how value is judged in South Africa, as it is. That's one. And the other one, my sense is that we need stronger voices of independent thought, critical independent thought, that I imagine universities should be doing, should be serving the country a lot better in that way, bringing people together, coalescing new critical thinking in the country and in public life than, in fact, we are doing. Silenced voices of the churches, and finally to bring in a new or renewed model of public accountability and civil society justice movement. And for me, this is not the service delivery protests that I don't count as what I'm saying. I think there's a genuine and legitimate civil society movement that is waiting to come to the fore in our country. Better stop there.
Well, that's a lot. And what a place to stop. I mean, what a tour de force. You've gone across the whole spectrum from Bafana and the FIFA World Cup to the Zuma presidency and the state of affairs in the ANC. If I didn't make it clear earlier, which I probably didn't, I'm thinking through my introductory remarks, we want to see this as Chatham House rules and make sure that we know that we're off the record, which doesn't mean that what Barney says is not replicable, but not attributable. Because I know this has been a very frank and open discussion, which is what I expected of you. But let me throw the floor open and comments are welcome. This is a discussion, not just questions, comments, anything you want to say. Gregory.
Question. Foreign direct into South Africa, is it increasing significantly? And if it is, what are the conditions of investment? I mean, are there conditions that came to that you have influence on social development as well as economic development? It sounds like it's not nearly enough, but I'm co-chairing a committee.
Gregory, we have a mic there.
Oh,
Might-
I'm
might
sorry.
help.
Yeah. I'm part of the reason for my question is that I'm currently co-chairing a committee of the International Law Association, the American branch. It's the Bilateral Investment Treaty and Development Committee. And my co-chair is a partner in a very large international law firm, very large, 2,300 members. And of course, he and I get along as friends, but we don't agree very much with regard to the role of most of his clients, who happen to be big corporations investing in usually in less developed economies. And I'm interested in development, social, economic development, and I tend to believe that large corporations that invest abroad should have some responsibility toward the societies that they invest in, not solely, not narrowly, investment with an aim to profit. Now, maybe but I'm just wondering what conditions, if any, are placed on foreign direct investment by the Development Ministry of South Africa. I don't know about the structure. I would also just say, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, I've not been to Africa, as I mentioned, but I've been involved in a lot of countries, and I've been involved a lot in China, a lot in many ways, including lectures at some of the leading Chinese law schools and business schools and so forth. My area of particular study in advanced law programs was Chinese economic law and the transformation of Chinese state-owned enterprises. So I have a sense of the Chinese model, and just a question.
Corporate responsibility question seems almost like a throwback to the 80s, but
I don't have the data. I don't have the figures. To some extent, I think you answered part of your question, because clearly there's not nearly enough foreign direct investment for the country, and that has been I'm sure Simon can talk to this, that has been a matter of enormous examination, certainly in Thabo Mbeki's time, as to what are the conditions necessary to attract foreign direct investment in the country. Fortunately, as my understanding, fortunately that the country's, there is in fact, there has been in the country itself a large amount of capital to enable some of the investment and development to be internal. And unfortunately, some of that capital, there was a time when it was allowed to be invested in the capital markets in London and New York. I don't see much of that, of the same phenomenon. There was a time when that seemed to be the phenomenon. Foreign direct investment is a problem. The Department of Trade and Industry recognizes that the strategy for trade and for industry, trade and industry in the country, leaves much to be desired, and that there is an effort. The new minister has promised to put forward a new industrial strategy for the country. I don't believe that foreign direct investment is affected by black economic empowerment per se, although I do think that black economic empowerment could be one of the partners that would interest investors to come to South Africa, but I don't see much of it personally. And I'm no expert at this at all. So a lot of work was done to make South Africa, certainly under Trevor Manuel and Thabo Mbeki, attractive to foreign investment, foreign direct investment. The results were not that promising. That's one of the issues. I think that the labor unions are saying that we've suffered so much, and the anger they have with the economic policy under the current environment is that, as they say, it's more of the same. But the benefits are not evident. The downside in unemployment and unable to create jobs are there for all to see. And Zwelinzima Vavi is basically saying, how long will this continue for, and why can't we rethink our entire economic strategy? And frankly, I don't think there's any sign of that.
Tony, yes. Yeah, Mamadou was coming with the...
Oh, thank you. Yeah, good to have you here, Bonnie. You talked about the moral voice. A lot of people are very worried about that. And you mentioned factors which have led to the worry, and I'm sure there's a lot. And it just, one has this concern that, you know, they always used to say, when Mandela goes, what's going to happen? With the passing of Sisulu Tambo, and surely in due course, he told us, at least after the World Cup, the inevitable passing of Madiba, and Desmond Tutu not getting any younger. One just wonders where this will, the momentum for the maintaining or strengthening the moral voice of the country will come from, and what value there would be in the idea of sort of establishing a sort of testament for the nation based on the seminal contributions and iconic status of those people. I went to Mount Vernon recently, and it's just Washington, fantastic. I gather you've got a statue to Tom Paine here. You know, Washington fought with arms, Tom Paine fought with his mind to bring about what we see today. And I just wonder, in South Africa, Barney, where do you see these qualities of leadership coming from, and what particular form do you think could the preservation of those ideas take shape?
One could go on to say that the problem we have in South Africa, for many of us, myself included sometimes, is that we're very, very good at seeing what is not and what is wrong and what is bad. We're also good at saying and seeing what we would like to see, what kind of South Africa we envision for ourselves, and why what we are experiencing is not what we envisage. But very few of us, at least I'm not aware of any, have moved to the point of saying this is what must be done. I think the reason for that is that for many of us, naturally, there is a lot of impatience, and most of the things that you are talking about will take a long time, are long-term. I can't imagine short-term interventions of the kind that we have in mind. And I happen to think that, like you, I think that what is important is to release South Africans out of one of the most terrible things about this, what is happening in South Africa today. It's just so many South Africans living in fear and being fearful for all sorts of reasons, whether it's crime or whether that they will be targeted by certain groups in the ruling party, or whether they will lose their jobs and they will not receive tenders or whatever it is. the extent of the silencing of voices in the country is very real. At least I also, there was an effort to silence me. It is a reality. This is not a fable. And so some of it, I suspect, is providing opportunities, Tony, for people to be free. There are real problems when you have a National Director of Public Prosecutions being Simelane and all that he says. He's wasted no time to show that he's not interested in fairness or justice and in his drive's particular agenda. There is, in fact, notwithstanding my respect for him, there is, in fact, a problem when the president overlooks Justice Museneke and handpicks a more junior judge of the Constitutional Court who had been the sole dissenting judge in a case. There is a problem with that. There is a problem if the chief of the police, if the chief of the National Intelligence Agency is drawn from the same group of people all around, even if we haven't seen anything. So there are issues that people are really, truly concerned about. And some of the examples you give are important. In a country like ours, where politics and patronage are becoming dominant and predominant, for many people it's very difficult to envisage life outside that patronage system. And we're moving to a situation where the patronage system is becoming very strong and very dominant. That is the reason I, for one, really do believe that a lot of work needs to be done to preserve universities and higher education and to resist efforts at encroaching on independence and autonomy of universities, because the chances are in the future that is going to be one critical place. That is why I think that the media and its diversity and independence is very, very important for our country, and it is already proving to be a useful thing that we do. It is important that that by some means must be preserved. We are not able, I don't think, and I don't know how one can do that, to look at the private sector with a great deal of the BEE elements. I mean, there's a contestation now about who's going to be the president. Is it Busa? One of those. And clearly there is a marginalization of the South African Council of Churches, where a group of church people have formed themselves around President Zuma, and they've called themselves Church Leaders Forum, and to actually function outside of that. So there is a lot of that going on. And I think the trick has got to be to try to preserve those institutions, media, universities, come to mind, that represents something of an independent mind for the country.
Let me follow up Tony's question, but first introduce David Ottawa, who just came into the room, who was Washington Post correspondent in Johannesburg for a number of years. When did you arrive in Johannesburg?
2 months before Mandela got out.
Okay, yeah, so it was 89, somewhere around there. Welcome, David. Somewhere around there. I was going to, you talked a lot about sort of internal ANC dynamics and the ANC Youth League, and et cetera. One of the things that sort of struck fear in the hearts of outside observers with Julius Malema and people around him, particularly in 2008 and early 2009, before Zuma became president, when the charges were pending and he was indicted, and that indictment was later dropped, was there attacks on the High Court, calling the Constitutional Court reactionary, and I'm sure people like Justice Dikangwa Seneki and Albie Sachs and others took high personal umbrage at that. But the point being, attacking the very basis of this constitutional democracy and an independent court system. And a lot of us from the outside who've been supportive of South Africa for many, many years feel that, well, for all that's going wrong and all the worrisome signs that are on the horizon, many of which you've just elaborated on very, very nicely, that the saving grace is that Constitution, is that independent court system. Does that hold? Is that really under attack?
Yeah, it does. I think that the Constitution in South Africa remains a very strong and very solid foundation for the future. But the Constitution, you see, I think Albert Sachs says this, doesn't exist by itself on its own. It exists to the extent that it is being applied and interpreted by a competent court, and it is appropriated and owned jealously by ordinary people. When you get situations where the chief of police tells you that the worst thing about this country is this Constitution, you do get worried. There have been signs and questions around whether what was intended to be the process for the transparent appointment of judges, whether in fact that is going to be sustained in the long time and with the same sort of regard about the fact that by and large judges can be appointed that can be expected not to be contaminated, if you like, by the politics of the day. Maybe that's far-fetched and unreasonable. But deep down, I have the idea that there will always be good judges in South Africa. There'll always be solid judges, because I happen to know that there are very good law schools in the country.
Work for you, Gregory.
So I think I worry less about the judiciary than some people do, even as I can say something about the way in which the Chief Justice was appointed, which I think was unfortunate and ill-advised. But I still think that there is a very good bench in the Constitutional Court, and that I think will remain so.
Professor, may I just ask one thing? In your analysis, I think you have covered a wide spectrum of issues. There's one issue that concerns me, and that's the xenophobic issue. And I would like to hear your comments on the role, not just the way in which foreigners are treated in some instances, but how do you see the future political role of foreigners in South Africa, and are there concerns about a new conflict fault line that may develop there?
If you ask me, my view, it's on record. I think that South Africa must come to terms with the fact that there'll always be people from all over, certainly all over Africa, but maybe elsewhere, who gravitate towards the country. I'm of the view that South Africa should be accommodating and can, because skills and expertise is not always there in South Africa itself. And actually, frankly, I don't think South Africa is being overrun by foreigners, as some people think. Of course, it doesn't mean that elements, foreigner or not, who are involved in crime just have to be dealt with by the laws of the country as they are. But I think we ought to be a more hospitable, more welcoming country than we are. There are many people, and I know this to be true because there are many universities in South Africa that would not be able to function in certain disciplines if they hadn't actually been open to scholars from other parts of the continent. So there's a very strong positive contribution that many people are taking. Of course, there are other foreigners who are in crime and all sorts of things, but those can be dealt with in the normal way by law, as it is. But the point you're making is more fundamental than that. It is that we need a kind of national orientation as a country, as a people, that basically says not only that many of us were refugees in different parts of the country, and many people out of the little they have, if you think of a country like Zambia, that opened itself to so much attack, it causes you to say, why can't we? But for me, it's a moral issue. It's about how do we, out of our own consciousness, why can't we be a country that knows that it will become great to the extent that it allows other people to find themselves in a country and to be great scholars, great scientists, and allowing the country to do that. But there's a reality, of course, that one must always be not unmindful of. It is the fact that where there are scarce resources, the people who will always be under pressure are those at the bottom end. I'm talking the people I deal with are people at a particular level, but there's another level where there's a real contestation for resources at a lower level, and there's no good preaching about what is the vision of the country when people are saying, oh, we can see these people are getting houses and we don't have houses, and a lot of it is about that. A lot of it is about more lower level contestation for resources.
But of course, for all of your history, migrant miners and others coming from Mozambique and other countries, but you would be running afoul of Senator McCain right now as we deal with our own immigration problems. And deny what is said on the Statue of Liberty's base. But anyhow, that's another issue. More questions, more comments?
I just want to ask a little bit more about your home area, Eastern Cape. When I was Consul General in Cape Town, I went up to Port Elizabeth every month. I got very involved there. I had something to do with getting Toza Mili Botha and his family out of there. I did hear that he was back as governor. Is that correct? And I'm curious about what's happening in PE now. It was a commercial or industrial area when I was there. I don't know if it still is or not. Just curious about what's happening.
Tozi was Director General of the Eastern Cape Province and went to become advisor to various ministers, Lindiwe Sisulu and others. Is very much in business, in black economic empowerment projects. He's now a member of parliament for COPE, the Congress of the People. The Eastern Cape in particular, but around PE, has really been hard hit for a variety hard hit in terms of development. It is, in fact, one of the areas that it was said after the last election that could be the target of opposition parties displacing ANC in terms of very much within reach. And the reason for that is that it is and has been for a long time a very strong ANC base. But in fact, a lot of the people there have felt that the ANC just has let the Eastern Cape down. Not least because the Eastern Cape government has in large measure been dysfunctional for a long time, where there's been large levels of corruption, where the metropolitan, Nelson Mandela metropolitan city has been very much corruption has been endemic. And in many ways, the contestation that I was talking about within the ANC has been a crippling factor in enable real development to take place. Hasn't been able to attract for an industrial zone of that nature. Hasn't been able to attract a lot of resources, although the Kuchat development zone still continues to be a promise for many people that it's going to bring jobs, but it's been very slow and very trickling. The government has invested a lot of money in the establishment of the new deep sea port, but it hasn't really translated into a large number of jobs or indeed the promised investment.
Okay, here, Priscilla. Got you first. You were closer.
Okay, I didn't want to take too much time since I've already had the privilege of time with Barney. I'm involved with a small group here. It's a U.S. South African NGO that brings about a dozen university students every year for a 6-month internship in Washington. And the students are chosen well ahead of time, and they're put through some leadership training in South Africa, and particularly community-oriented types of projects. And then when they go back, they spend a full year serving the community in some group form. I've been so impressed by the quality of these young people that I've worried very much about what's ahead for them in South Africa and how long it's going to take for them to realize their potential there. I don't get the sense that within the ANC or the body politic that young people are being given openings to promote. I don't see them being reflected yet in the political system. Is that an unfair observation? I haven't been to South Africa for quite a while, so it may well be unfair.
I don't know. I'll ask these colleagues. It is my sense that I don't think we've got a very clear, as a country, policy on young people and youth development. There's been a new agency, but what has happened, I think wrongly, it has been appropriated by the ANC Youth League. It has become an agency of the ANC Youth League. It's as if, and this is allowed, it's as if young people, if they are to be young at all, they must be ANC, and they must be part of the patronage of Julius Malema. And somehow that's marginalizing large numbers of young people. As I said earlier on, you hardly hear any strategy, any youth strategy, at least I'm not aware of any, about youth development. You hardly hear anybody really saying that this is the policy position on young people in the country. After a year or so, we still don't have that. As far as education is concerned, obviously we're beginning to see, and we're hoping to see more about how training impacts on young people. But with a shrinking economy, it is always going to be a challenge as to where they actually go. I mean, that may sound very sort of bland and despairing, because part of it with me is that I always think that there are opportunities for young people in a young economy, a country like ours. Part of what it means is to help young people to be positive about the future and give them courage and resources that are available for them to work together or in some sort of form or cluster, and not feel that in order for them to get anywhere, they must be involved in the entrepreneurship and corruption that is going place. If we're not careful, we're leading to into a situation where the only way, if you're young, you're going to get anywhere, is to try to be part of the entrepreneurial elite.
Simon. Wait for the mic.
Thanks.
Okay, we understand.
Just to follow up on Priscilla's intervention there, and it is an excellent program, and I'm also privileged to be part of it. I wanted, on the youth front, the finance minister in his budget this year talked about the beginnings of a dual labor market, of incentivizing the employment of youth. I've spoken to him, and he's very, very forthright about the problem of youth unemployment, and the fact is that there are generations of young people who don't have jobs and may well never have them. And he obviously is very much in favor of working some kind of policy change that would, as I say, incentivize the employment of young people. But at the same time, he's facing a huge obstacle from that, from people like Zwelinzima Vabi, who obviously do not want to see that happen. I wonder where you come down on that issue.
I think the problem is that there's bits and pieces here and there. We need a coherent, credible policy on young people and young people's development in the country. The labor relations environment, and this is the contention, it was strange that it would come from the Minister of Finance in the first instance. I thought it should have come from the Minister of Labor. And because the Minister of Finance isn't going to have a framework for seeing what actually happens to those young people. I personally think that it is very, very important that young people be employed and be given experience and skills in a manner that would enable improvement and development to take place. For example, I think the state should or could put resources for more young people to stay longer at school and to gain a skill. For young people to be part of, I know that I was in England during the beginnings of the Thatcher years, to be able to be involved in community upliftment projects, schools, painting schools, repairing hospitals, learning a skill to provide furniture or whatever in public in the public sector. If that's for example, I think I can't imagine anybody would be worried about that. What I think is a worry, which I think I share, is what in effect would become the exploitation of young people in the labor market at a time when there is high unemployment in the country, and many the fear that that might actually be used to displace workers in favor of underpaid youth employees. And that is why I say that a proposal like that should have been part of a comprehensive labor market policy that would come from the Department of Labor. The unfortunate thing is that it came from the Minister of Finance in a manner that was completely disjointed from a wider, more comprehensive policy.
Would you favor, going back to something you were just saying about government putting more resources into extending the education period and to skilling young people? I mean, would you be in favor of some kind of national service of a civilian nature?
Oh, sure, I am. I mean, there was a sort of announcement by Minister Sisulu to that effect. I think there must be. For a country like that, we need a sort of. I'm not talking necessarily in the military, although that may be part of it. But there is there could be a very useful deployment of young people at a certain level to be involved and paid for to some extent to be active in community projects and uplifting of people. And it certainly costs less than what unemployment does to young people, actually.
Well, how would you rate the possibility of that actually happening?
I haven't heard anybody. I mean, we've got a death of ideas. I don't hear. You see, my problem is I don't. What I'm hearing, which I think is useless, really, is a whole rhetoric about who are these people? These people, labor brokers. It's the least of the problems of the country. The problem of the country is unemployment, is unemployed youth. And we're not getting people to say, what are we doing with this pressing problem that is necessary for the country? The problem of the country is skills. Very many, generally young people, but other young people, who are out of employment, not because there are no jobs, but because they don't have skills for the jobs that are available. What is a comprehensive policy on skills? We're not hearing that.
David, did I see your hand flick?
I don't know whether you've already covered this issue. I don't know whether you've already covered this issue or not, but when we were down there, this regards race relations and the role of place of whites in the new South African society. When we were there, it was the general assumption that the English would slowly leave, the Afrikaners would stay, and the English would slowly leave, and the English would have the greatest difficulty of finding their place in the new South Africa. Have the whites found their role in the new South Africa, or are they slowly leaving the country?
David, I have two senses to that question. I don't have a sense any longer of a huge drift out of the country. Simon might correct me. I don't have that sense. I don't have the sense of white people generally, as was the case in 1995, 96. There appears to be a trickle of South Africans coming back to South Africa. There appears to be. In terms of race relations, I think at a sophisticated level, frankly, I don't think it matters whether you're English or Afrikaner. What is important is whether you think you've got a future in the country. There is a concern that has been expressed again and again about whether young, white, generally males, graduates, have a future in the country. The truth of the matter, statistics actually speak differently. That the employment, there are more black graduates who don't get employment than there are white graduates. More white male graduates get employed in the country than the black male graduates. And so the reality is different from what it is often made out to be. There isn't a legal position of discrimination that causes white people to flight out of the country. That's not a reality. Often it is said, but it is not true in terms of statistics. But however, there is an issue around race. For my money, I think South Africans have been tutored, I think, to express themselves less about race as much as they can. Part of it, of course, is the rhetoric of reconciliation a la Nelson Mandela. During the time of the World Conference Against Racism, in the run-up to it, there was an effort to create an open dialogue around race in the country, to give people a sort of analytical tools to be able to address race, and it becomes a much more open, engaged issue rather than a suppressed issue. But that wasn't, I mean, I think Thabo Mbeki was reviled for raising some of the issues around race in the country for a very long time. We were reviled for raising the issues of race in the context of the media in the country. For a very range of different reasons, it's emerging at the moment. It's emerging in a manner that is non-analytical, that is non-critical, and in many respects is reactionary. It's about blaming others for just about everything instead of really understanding the dynamics of race in the context of a country that is quite confused about itself and what it should be and can become. The second way in which I wish to come to this is a fascinating piece I read in the International Herald Tribune about India some time ago after the Mumbai terrorist attacks, which was basically saying that there was a time when the intellectual people in the United States in India and business retreated and almost, somebody would say, outsourced politics to certain elements that they despised, and politics became a dirty thing. It's not for the intellectual. It's not for the clever. It's not for the rich. And that is why after Mumbai you had a situation where this article says, for the first time you find the uprising of the intellectual and for the rich who feel let down by a state that is unable to understand the basic thing about the security and the needs of the people, and politicians who've just been unable to reckon with the dynamics of, if you like, world terrorism and God knows what. And the result of that, the article says, there is a renewed interest in politics, almost people saying, let's get in there and take over the politics and claim it for ourselves. Now, my sense is there are signs or even a danger in the country that there is a major retreat from certain elements like us in terms of the politics of our country, and this is convenient because we can blame others. We take no responsibility. We sit back and watch others, if you like, fail us. And until such time, the quality of the people in the parliament of our country today is a lot worse than it was in 1994. In 1994, the best that South Africa could offer were in parliament. And within 2 years of that, after 1996, we saw many of them moving out and setting themselves up in business and God knows what, and less of them. And that deterioration has been going on. And I see there's not enough analysis of what actually that phenomenon is doing. And my eyes were opened to this by this International Herald Tribune article about India. And it so happened that I was in Mumbai when this happened. I just was not in that hotel.
I said, thank God.
Okay, well, we're coming close to the end of our allotted time, so let's make the interventions quickly.
Yeah, just a sort of brief supplementary to what totally different subject. Barney, if you could put on your other hat, your mortarboard, and keep I want to raise something about education. Well, for my sins, I was the last eye on probably 10 years of State of the Nation speeches in South Africa and presidential budget votes. And we nearly let through some awful things, which happens in newspapers quite regularly, including one reference we nearly let through once, which was calling for increased penalties for the victims of rape, which we spotted just at the last minute. But I noticed from the wires, which I'm still connected to, that the president of South Africa, Zuma, gave his budget vote yesterday. He presented his budget vote to Parliament. And in that document, which I won't bore you with the details, he talks about the revitalization of the country's education system. Sorry, that was today. He said that today. Which is, he says, is going well. Talks about the role of the basic and higher education departments, improving performance in schools, etc., and the government allocating a total of 3.2 billion rand in infrastructure funds to universities over the next 2 financial years, and noting in passing, very relevant to this, that 70% of all South Africans are under the age of 35, and sort of making the point that the educational commitment is as strong, if not stronger than ever, and specifically talking about university education and the critical areas of engineering, life and physical sciences, teacher education, and health sciences. I just wonder if you would just briefly tell us something about the government's commitment to education, and higher education in particular, bearing in mind Thabo Mbeki's higher education working groups and things like that. I just would be very interested to know how if you could just say where you see it at the moment.
Let me start by saying the starting point for education in South Africa is recognizing that the education system is in crisis, and it has been for a long time. I've often felt that, to some extent, I think it was a mistake to separate education from higher education, or to set it up in the way in which it has been, in the sense that schools are a provincial competency, and National Department of Education's mandate is really policy framework and kind of monitoring that policy and distributing resources to the provinces. And therefore, a huge Department of Education does seem to me, for basic education, is going to have very little to do, and indeed very little maneuver, because the capacity to actually own what happens in the schools is not in the National Department of Education, is in the Provincial Department of Education. And any minister there has got very limited room for maneuver. So that seems to me it's one of those many changes that were made that I don't think is sensible. It might have been better to include basic education, if you like, with youth or whatever. So one doesn't get enough of a sense, a pronouncement that says we need extraordinary intervention in this country to fix education. Call together all the elements in the education system to say we need an extraordinary intervention to fix education. We still are not hearing that. There seems to be some sort of thing that passes away that the government is not recognizing sufficiently. And as what I'm saying, I've said in public in South Africa as well. The second thing is that the truth of the matter is that we do have a very, very good and solid higher education system in the country. My sense as a higher education leader and manager, we have a higher education system that is competitive with the best, I think, in the world. But it is true that that higher education system has been under-resourced for a long time, and that the resources into the higher education since 1987 have been reducing. And the great thing that this government has done in the last stages of Thabo Mbeki's government, Naledi Pandor, is to begin to put money towards infrastructure development. It appears that that is continuing, and that can only be good. We had a higher education summit recently with the minister that all of us, myself included, felt was really better than we feared. It began to be a real opportunity where higher education, all the various actors in higher education, really began to say, what can we do better in order to produce a higher education system? So what the president is saying is true, that a certain amount of resources for infrastructure are important. But the critical issues are not being addressed. The critical issues in South Africa is that there will soon not be enough properly qualified academics and researchers to really equip universities properly very, very soon, in another 5 to 10 years' time, because there aren't enough new scholars who are coming into. There aren't enough, the country is not producing enough master's and doctoral graduates at the moment, nor is it retaining enough of them in higher education to be able to replace those who are actually exiting the system. There are not enough students who are staying at universities long enough in the country. Most of them tend to leave after the first degree and never come back. There are no incentives for students to stay on in higher education. There are no programs to attract people to do master's degrees and doctoral degrees very much. And many universities are struggling to find resources for that to actually happen. That is clearly that's a very serious problem in terms of sustainability for higher education in the country. So while that is true, there's more that needs to be done, and I'm not sure that we're moving in that direction sufficiently.
Well, thank you, Barney. I've had to bite my tongue and be very disciplined myself not to dominate the questions, because there's so much else I would like to ask you. In fact, I'm tempted to ask everybody to come across the street and have a drink and just keep this thing going, which is the way we would have done it in the old days. But and it's questions like, so why did Terra Lakota not run for president, and what happened there, and in terms of education, what about the community college system? Why hasn't that worked? And also some more reminiscences about the old days and whatever happened to the intellectual capital of black consciousness. But we'll have to leave that for another time and another day, because we are out of time. And this has just been a delight for me. I hope everybody else has enjoyed it. Join me in thanking Barney Pichana for this.